So this is one of those questions and one of those topics which is deceptive. It's deceptive because it hides a very, very big, and I'm going to make it a bit bigger, very, very big potentiality. And also you have to work out how it's going to happen, and that's going to affect things. You see, Italy staying neutral in World War II basically requires you get rid of this man. Because Mussolini is never going to be neutral. For him to be in a situation where he stabs Hitler in the back, he's not going to be neutral. He's going to attack Hitler. He's always going to be seeking glory and aggrandizement for himself. And if you replace him with a democratic faction early on, longer term, then why is Italy going to be neutral? They're probably allied. And that changes the context of everything completely again. So you have to come up with a reason for Mussolini to fall that's going to be murky enough, muddy enough, and realistic enough to be true. Because that's the point about alternate history. Alternate history is about studying the course of events and trying to work out why things happened the way they were and why planning went the way it did. And it's an interesting one for looking at planning because, yeah, there are a lot of issues. A lot of issues. Now, Mussolini joining the war, he joins late, he charges into France, he suffers not a defeat, but let's be honest, the Italian component of Battle of France is really not a glorious victory for them. Mainly because they're attacking into a heavily defended position. But they were tying down quite a lot of forces to do it. They were. So, let's consider what other options. You see, in 1938, Mussolini hates Victor Emmanuel. He hates there being a king. He keeps talking about making a republic, but he can't because the monarch is more popular than he is, and the troops are more loyal to the monarch than he is, and the more army commanders, etc., are loyal to him and the king than he is. In fact, the vast majority of the armed forces are far more loyal to that man, as small as he might be, than that man, as fat as he might be. They really are. And there is this beautiful scenario in 1938 where Mussolini finally tries to get more power, and his concession is he puts an act through Parliament that declares First Marshal of the Empire the new senior rank for the armed forces will be held by two people, the King and the Prime Minister. And the King considers vetoing it. He gets advised not to. He gets advised, no, it's perfect within the statute of the Constitution, all these things. But he really does want to get rid of it. Because one of the things about Emmanuel is he is... How do I put this? Cautious. He doesn't want to overreach. It's one of those scenarios where you're looking at a monarch who is very much trying to remember that his duty is to reign, not rule, and doesn't want to get involved unless he has to. And he's relying on the wider community to deal with Mussolini. Because that's what they're supposed to do. He's not supposed to get involved in politics. Unfortunately, his slowness to act and eventually his slowness to actually organize a peace deal with the Allies taints the Italian royalty completely and ultimately leads to their downfall in a referendum post World War II. But in his defense, he was acting in the best constitutional advice out that he was getting at the time. In fact, it was terrible. So, here's the scenario. If he did veto it, Fat Boy Fun Boy, the less improved World War II edition, aka Mussolini, more than likely decides to overplay his hand, because let's be honest, that's a track record of pretty much every one of the fascist dictators, barring Franco, who tended to play it very, very cautiously. And he probably tries to topple Victor Emmanuel. The problem with that is, A, Umberto's around, who's Emmanuel's son, and is a fairly decent military commander, and lots of other military commanders are around who are far more loyal to the monarchy than they are to Mussolini. So he vetoes it. Mussolini tries something. He might kill Victor Emmanuel, he might not. But the odds are you get something approaching a civil war. It will be over quite quickly because the army will outnumber and outgun the people who will support Mussolini, and there are enough opposition to Mussolini that the number of supporters is not going to be great. Mussolini never seems to realize one of the reasons he has the power he does is because the institutions he's taken over. Declaring war on those institutions, the institutions will win. But there are two things that will likely happen in this scenario. Italy will be in a very fragile state. They were worn out after Abyssinia. Mussolini got promises from Hitler that war wasn't going to be at least till 1943 or later, and his forces weren't going to be ready till then, when they sign the agreements they do. So the forces are now going to have had a civil war, and whilst I don't think there are going to be a large number of personnel vying for Mussolini in this fight if he picks a fight by actually attacking the monarchy. There will be some. That will cause damage. That will put Italy on the back foot. Italy looking internally. And as such, that pretty much takes Italy out of the running for being part of World War II. Like Spain. Whilst I do not see this as being as large a civil war or as painful a civil war as Spain went through, I do see it being a war, and I do see them needing a period of time to recover. And that means they're not getting involved in World War II. They're watching from the sidelines. Which is okay. But it does change World War II, because I don't see there being a German invasion of Greece under this circumstance, or North Africa campaign, or any of those things. I really don't. It doesn't make sense for Germany to do that. It's not their viable edge. But let's talk about this. And honestly, there is the possibility that if it starts in 1938, there is still a civil war raging in 1939. But as I said, I don't think it will be that long. I think its impact will be felt for a long time. But I don't think it'll be that long. And they're going to be neutral. They're going to need to be sorting themselves out. They might want to get involved, but they're not going to. Not in the European war. There is part of me which thinks that depending on what's happened in the European war, you might see the Italians getting involved in what we'll be talking about towards the end of this video. But yeah, the easiest way to come with for Italy staying neutral is to make it have a bit of a civil war. And the easiest cause for that, the thing which would have caused the most stupid reaction from Mussolini, because it would imprint his pride, not his logic, his pride, and most likely to happen from the other side, is the veto of Victor Emmanuel of this field marshal of the empire. I think that happens. I can see that happening. And that means that Italy is neutral. They might want to get involved. They might be... Well, I could see them, especially having dealt with potential fascist rebellion, they could be very, very much, how do I put this, the level of neutral which is rapidly giving supplies to the other powers. And I could see them fortifying their Austrian and French borders heavily. But those are most mountainous regimes. Very mountainous regions. I think I call them regimes rather than regions there, didn't I? Yeah, mountainous regions. They are, as proved in World War One, defensive nightmares. Defensive dreams, offensive nightmares. Defensive nightmares from the perspective of the offenders. I therefore do not think that they suffer much of a problem. Yes, the Germans can fly over it. They can fly over Switzerland. Not good. The Swiss will patrol their air quite vigorously. They can fly from Austria over the Alps that direction, and they can fly over France, but to what end? To start a war with Italy? What point? What purpose? What does it serve them? What does it get them? I don't see it happening. And in many ways, Hitler would not be upset about Mussolini going at this point. He wouldn't be upset about him really going at any point, realistically. But the thing is, it wouldn't bother him much. It's not part of his calculus, really, and he's not going to bend over backwards to try and put Mussolini back in power or save him at this point. And he doesn't have the forces to do so. In 1938, he doesn't. He really doesn't. Look at what Germany has in 1938. They ain't doing anything. They just ain't. So, that all being said, shameless book plug. Now, shameless book plugs. They're all about me promoting my books. Quite literally. They are shameless book plugs, and they're because, as an academic, well, how successful our publications are how we are rated. They're how we get promoted, how we get hired, how we get evaluated, everything. So, as no one else will advertise them for me, occasionally I think the publisher puts a tweet out. I do it. I advertise my books. I've got more coming soon, hopefully. I've got a Historiathon happening soon, which is going to raise money. Well, the whole purpose of it is to do 36 hours answering naval history questions and all those things to hopefully raise money to pay for the pictures that I need to put into the next books. Because the annoying thing is you write books and that's easy. Getting the rights for the pictures so you can publish those books, that's the expensive stuff. That's the expensive stuff. It truly is. But it's all fun. And it's all thanks to you that is possible. It's all thanks to your support. You will fund my research. You will fund everything I do. So Patreon and Patreon questions like this one today. They're what fund my research. The memberships on the channel are what fund the research. The people who watch the videos and sit through the adverts, which I have in them occasionally, they're what fund the research. They're what fund the books being bought. They're what fund the trips to the archives. All those things. That what makes it possible to be a naval historian for me. So thank you. That's where you're helping. That's where it all goes to. Thank you. But let's get back to the changes of this piece of history, because there are so many changes. It really is. There is just so much changing. There are so many things changing. It's a constant. But in this one, a lot of the strategic calculus of World War II and a lot of decisions made change completely. Let's start off with the fact that at the very beginning of the war, when you've got September 1939, when you've got decisions taking place, where are the assets going to be deployed? Well, has Italy completed their littorios with a civil war going on? Have they managed to get them out into service? Are they even fielding a proper fleet at this point? And if they are, they're neutral. They're no longer part of the fascist coalition. They're very much not part of the fascist coalition. They've got a monarch, probably some democratic members of parliament, etc., in charge, running things. But pretty much it. 1938-39 Italy is probably looking like 1943 Italy did after the fall of Mussolini. Or similar therein, in terms of its government and its structures. Which means if you're deterring and dealing with Germany, for starters, when they're going to, there's no chance of the Italians tying down any of the British forces, any of the naval forces. And you're going to be moving forces around. Now, interesting enough, to me, I actually had a conversation with someone about this when I was doing this, and they basically went, does that mean it might be one of the Queen Elizabeths, not Royal Oak, sitting in Scapa Flow? And I went, looking at the stats and the options, no. No. That doesn't fit where any of them would be. It would still be in Royal Oak sitting in Scapa Flow. But the interesting thing is, there's going to be a lot more destroyers around. There's going to be a lot more sloops around. A lot more. Think about it from this perspective. Will I have left my modern destroyers, any of my modern destroyers, in the Mediterranean under these circumstances? Will I left any of my modernized or modern battleships anywhere near the Mediterranean in these circumstances? That force is all going to be concentrated in the home fleet. It's going to literally be sitting there in the home fleet. I'm not going to be deploying ships down to the Mediterranean. I'm not going to reinforcing. I'm not going to have ships operating in the Red Sea in case the Italian Italian naval forces in Italian East Africa decide to start causing trouble in the ocean. They're not going to be anywhere near that. Which means, conversely, there's going to be no potential scenario of tribal-class destroyers bumping into the Graf's Bay off the coast of Africa, because they won't be there. Which conversely means the Graf's Bay gets into the Indian Ocean, there's probably going to be even less forces sitting there. But there might be. There might be forces there. What would those forces be centered on? I'm not sure. Could be Eagle. Could be Hermes. Probably a couple of cruisers. But either way, nothing different than historically will happen. So all those forces are going to be back in the home fleet. But it's not just in terms of the sea forces. There's also going to be the air forces and land forces. Yes, in 1939, there aren't masses of British forces over in North Africa. There aren't massive British forces in the Middle East. There aren't massive British forces around the world. There are enough. There are garrisons, but there aren't oodles and oodles of them. But still, there are some, and frankly, you can start changing which ones you're drawing from, probably. In this scenario, you're not drawing from the eastern ones. You're drawing from the African and Middle Eastern ones. Those are going to be the garrisons you're going to draw down. Not the garrisons in the Far East, because that's where Japan is, and Japan is a threat. And that changes things, doesn't it? That changes things quite heavily. So this is going to make the European war very different. Because it's not just British forces which will change their position, but French forces which will change their position. And that gets intriguing once you start to realise certain stats and start to go into certain pieces of information. And there's a lot of information about. There's a lot of information for this. Both France and Norway. Now, Norway, why would I say Norway, Metaphor? Well, there's going to be a lot more naval resources in the home fleet. I'll be talking about these in slightly more detail later, but if you have enough ships in the home fleet, enough of the Mediterranean fleet ships in the home fleet, just think what happens differently. Imagine if instead of the H-class flotilla, it's the second flotilla of tribals which gets sent into Narvik for what is the second Battle of Narvik, when it's the first Battle of Narvik being the battle between the German and Norwegians. Well, they have enough gunfire and a big enough, tough enough vessels that battle could go very differently. They have a big firepower advantage over the H-class, but also over the German vessels involved in that scenario. And a very different raison d'etre. That can change things, but there's also the fact that a couple of extra battleships, even if that's all you have running around in aggregate, is a couple of extra battleships in the home fleet, an extra carrier maybe in the home fleet at this point. Well, that's another carrier group, and so it's a carrier group that could be sitting off the coast of Norway. There is a real decision made to bring them home and rearm them because, they're trying to do the flow they are with the things they have. If they have another carrier battle group, if they have another carrier, another couple of battleships, the odds are you leave a task force off the coast of Norway. So the British don't come home and leave it unattended for a bit while they're changing around their force structures. In which case, Shameless and Eisenhower could run into that. Now, I was looking at the options, and the options they could run into are Warspite and Malaya. Possibly Warspite and Valiant. Now, Shameless and Eisenhower can outrun Warspite and Valiant, they really can. But if it's Warspite, Valiant, and Eagle assisting them, well, that's a strike of fairly skilled torpedo bombers going into hit, probably focusing their targets on one of those ships, and that means if it gets damaged, it's going to be there at prey of two World War I vintage but modernised 15-inch gun battleships, who are not going to be inclined to take prisoners. In terms of, we don't feel like capturing you. We'll sink you and take your crew, but we're not capturing you as a ship. And that changes things. If in the first invasion, in the first flow of the invasion, they lose a Scharnhorst, they lose maybe more of their ships more quickly going into Narvik, therefore that changes the deployment of troops, and maybe they don't even withdraw the forces. They don't need to withdraw the forces. They already have the forces in the home fleet to pick up the troops, so they can go pick up the troops and take them, and they don't need to do that, do the withdrawal. It's going to change the history in Norway. I'm going to get into this in a bit later, but there are the attacks on Narvik, Trondheim, and Bergen. All will run a far more increased risk of bumping into a significant naval presence, because there is going to be that much force there, that much more capability. And then you got France itself. You see, historically, you have 180,000 troops on the Italian border, roughly. Now, let's say you did have increased forces down there anyway because of the Civil War, kind of like what the Norwegians were doing up with the Finnish border, their border with Finland and Sweden, in the north. Well, if there's no risk there, don't you redeploy about half of them? Maybe 90,000 extra troops available for the north? If you've got 90,000 extra troops available in the north, what do you do with them? That's a large force. To my mind, there's got to be at least one extra division in the Ardennes, but there might not be. It might not be. But Italy neutral changes things. As I said, France doesn't need to protect its southern border. And so we end up as a scenario coming face to face with there being realistically two options. And those two options are France, the French troops. There is an extra division of French troops supporting Belgians in the Ardennes. And therefore the Germans really get their strategic gamble turns into a rout, because if you can hold up the German troops in the Ardennes long enough, that you can position your forces to crush them, they're in trouble. And I don't think it takes more than an extra division there to buy the extra time you need. You don't need a lot longer. An extra division reduces the amount of blockades which are unmanned, the blocking positions which don't have any protections, because one trouble is there aren't enough Belgian or French troops there. And so they can't man all the positions they create to block. And those positions which aren't blocked are just peacetime exercises for the engineers, the combat engineers, to remove for the Germans. But if you have an extra division there, it's going to be a lot more of them actually filled with troops going, you're not going to remove this easily. You're just not. And the French also have quite a lot of anti-tank capabilities, so add them in, yeah. Alternatively, France could fall as it does historically. They could just put more troops where they traditionally put more troops and not bother about not have enough troops in the Ardennes again. They could do that. The reality, though, is that's going to have wildly different outcomes. Because if they do the former, then war could have been over relatively quickly. Hitler himself expects to lose for quite a lot of points. He's buoyed by the victories in Norway, and he thinks, go for it. Go for it, because if the odds are they lose, they might as well do it running the risk that they have a total victory, rather than redoing World War One. That's his plan. That's why he follows the attacks he does. So yeah. Without the complete win in Norway, though, and without the fall of France, what happens? They've got no Italian ally. They might be forced to sue for peace. That could be embarrassing. That could be embarrassing. Now, if they do win, though, well, Mesopotamia may still be necessary. However, there again, let's think about it. Without the Italians being part of the war, will the Force de Rapide, let alone anything else, actually be in the ports in North Africa where they were historically? Or will they be working out of British ports? Okay, yes, the Force de Rapide is there, but it's also in a position where it is to cover for the Italians trying to break out, but also German surface raiders in the Central Atlantic. Well, if you've not got a threat of the Italians breaking out, then you might as well have your Force de Rapide in the north of the UK to help back up the patrol against German surface raiders trying to break out around the north through the GI-UK gap. Sitting in Scapa Flow, therefore, might be the French fleet. With the home fleet, in which case the Force de Rapide... Do you need to Mesopotamia if there's no Force de Rapide there, if there's no big forces there? Not realistically. It's a port, but it has no intrinsic value because you're not in an offensive war against French. What matters to you is to control the French ships. Which means they're going to be neutral now, either interned in Britain, or they're going to become very much Free French. And that adds a whole other complicated level. Best they go neutral than Free French. I will explain why in a second. I will explain why. But yes, Mesopotamia might not be necessary. And if Mesopotamia isn't necessary, if the French forces aren't so deployed that they're going to be condemned, then Force H is going to change its structure completely. So everything changes, and I mean everything changes. There is a trouble with one of these scenarios, though, because of the phrasing on the question. It has to be Japan attacks Britain. And I'm going to have to play fast and loose with that to an extent anyway later on, but to try and keep it as accurate as possible to the question, well, if France is still fighting, that means Germany's in a tight corner. And yes, the British are going to be contributing ground forces, but the Battle Atlantic has changed, and a lot of things will be very different. There's going to be no French bases for submarines. I highly doubt, under the circumstances with that much naval force there, as said, the odds are not in the German favour, considering where the British were deployed and where they were going around. My view is probably Norway is even more likely to end up as a sort of stalemate. And if you consider the overland routes from southern Norway to northern Norway, to central Norway, let alone from central Norway to northern Norway, and the viability of those routes for large forces, I could see probably Trondheim North still being Norwegian territory, and they're actually being fighting in Norway. I could see it being turned like that. I could also see it have gone potentially worse for the Germans, because I could see it turning into a scenario where if the fighting carries on long enough, the British get involved and they're fighting and pushing, trying to help out Norwegians, and I could see the Swedes getting involved under certain circumstances if the Germans push their luck too far. I could see that being a very, very bad scenario. I could see also the Finns getting maybe involved on the Norwegian side. Especially if the Swedes get involved, because the Swedes have been supporting the Finns. It's a sibling relationship up there. They will fight like anything, but attack one, all the rest will get involved. So that means there's no change to move into Indochina, because especially if France is still fighting, Indochina is definitely still under French control. There's going to be no one going, you need to hand over this place to us. You need to hand over this place to our ally. You can't protest. No, the French will protest quite heavily. They might even have ships out there. They might even have their own force out there. It's a scenario which is not going to be good for the Japanese to push forward in. And thanks to French Indochina and the Philippines, well, I suppose you could say the Japanese could attack Hong Kong, but if they attack Hong Kong, that's part of the British war plans anyway. So they could go and attack Hong Kong, but what's that going to get them? There's nothing there really worthwhile in Hong Kong. The risk you're getting for attacking it versus the reward as you're opening, nowhere near. Nowhere near. The British aren't going to charge absolutely, over insanely forward under that circumstance. And you have to remember again the Japanese war plans. So Hong Kong, not enough. And with with French and American control, the Philippines and Indochina, getting to Singapore, it's a nightmare. So pretty much your only scenario where it works, where there are enough land forces committed by the British fighting in Europe, because remember, there's no North Africa campaign, so there's got to be an actual land campaign still going on, but there's no French involvement, the French have fallen, is if Norway's still fighting, if there's still fighting going on in Norway. Because that will provide, there will be British ground forces being committed there. That's the reality of it. France has fallen. Norway hasn't. Mainly because the German forces probably had to get damaged severely at the beginning. So naval forces had to run into naval forces. Which gives us this, ultimately, as a scenario. Italy is neutral. France is Vichy. Norway's a battlefront. What is different in 1941? Well, the big thing going on here is that the fleet the Royal Navy is facing is tiny compared to what they historically were worrying about. Furthermore, there's the fact that Vichy France does not have the navy it had historically. So that's going to change things dramatically again. So in 1941, when this scenario I've put, things like HMS Furious and R-Class, etc. could be there. But when I worked it through more later on, things were different. And as said, with increased forces deployed in Norway, Glorious is not going to come off, I suppose, so she's probably not going to be running to Scharnhorst solo, and they're going to lose them. So you probably have lost at least one Scharnhorst. Again, I'm trying to think of what's going to make the Germans back down. They're going to have lost one Scharnhorst, and the British are not going to have lost Glorious. Because if you've taken out a Scharnhorst in the earlier thing, there's no way they're running a risk of another one, of sending one out that will actually bump into Glorious. But also, Glorious is not going to be on loan again. So if she's on a loan again and there's a Scharnhorst lost, things are different. It does mean that they might not do the Great Breakout until they have Bismarck ready. In which case, Bismarck and the remaining Scharnhorst might be the two ships going out, rather than Bismarck and Prince Eugen, which does actually make sense if they're trying to break out. But that's a problem for them again, because if you're trying to break out and you've got two battleships, that means the British are going to change their responses. And the Battle of Denmark Straits, the historic battle, does take place in 1941, along with the Battle of Cape Matapan and all sorts of things. It's supposed to take place. There's been no Taranto in this scenario, though. There's probably going to be no Mers Kabir. So in some ways, the British Night Strike torpedo attack systems are, to an extent, still on the wraps. The British might have used them where they needed to, but they probably haven't needed to use them as much, or had the opportunity to use them as much. Which could be interesting. Anti-submarine warfare, in terms of the Battle Atlantic, if you're trying to use the French ports to get to operate the support submarines, well, I now have a lot of carrier and other assets the Navy can chuck against you. It's not just going to be strategic bombers. It can be carriers and hunter-killer groups with carriers wandering around the Bay of Biscay, which is high risk for the carriers, yes. So not really something sensible, but it's possibly going to be something there. But before you even get to those being built, you're not going to get access probably to the ones in Norway you need, and with bombers operating from Norway, there's going to be all sorts of areas that they can reach to. It's a nightmare. And the fleet structure, well, the fleet structure and disposition's something I spent quite a while working on and thinking about. My theory is that the British will put a fleet in the Indian Ocean, not in the Far East, in the Indian Ocean. Why? There's more bases there to support it, and also it's close enough to respond to issues with Japan, but can also make use of Mediterranean infrastructure, whilst the in-area facilities being improved, and can be rapidly recalled from the Mediterranean should it be necessary. So should there be a problem, the Indian Ocean is the best spot to have a fleet. But this adds another problem for the Japanese in terms of attacking it, doesn't it? Because attacking a Royal Navy fleet based on Ceylon, well, that means you have to get into the Indian Ocean. And A, that's a trek, and B, how do you get there without being spotted coming? Actually, being spotted coming going past British territories is going to be hard enough. Let alone Allied territories. So, my view is that probably the French ships have been neutral, maybe be turned over to the Free French, but probably neutral. But those could also be components in the force structures. So, when I was talking about the British Home Fleet, North Atlantic, I worked out, probably is going to have Formidable, it's probably going to have Victorious, Indomitable, and Renown, King George V, Prince of Wales, and Duke of York. That's probably what's there. I've put Illustrious as now the Force H carrier. Illustrious and a Nelrod. And the reason I've got them there, have one of the Nelrods and Illustrious in Gibraltar, is because are there any the French ships, battleships which were back at home? They're the older ones. If they get taken over, they're a problem. If they're trying to break out, if you have Illustrious and a Nelrod, either Nelson or Rodney, and I would think probably Nelson in Gibraltar, that's probably enough to hold them back. That's more than probably enough to stop them getting out. Nelson doesn't have to be particularly. You don't have to be particularly fast to block the Straits of Gibraltar from Gibraltar. And if you've got an Illustrious with you, then you can operate defensively, do some patrolling, and between the two of you, you can keep them back. And act as a sort of slower Force H, a backstop in the Atlantic. Now, the Indian Ocean Fleet. The Indian Ocean Fleet is interesting. I would say you're going to have the Queen Elizabeth class, especially as the KGVs to come online. They're going to be slowly sent out there. That's what I would do. KGV comes online, Queen Elizabeth class goes out. KGV comes online, Queen Elizabeth class goes out to the Indian Ocean. And slowly build them up out there. I would say they'll be supported by whichever Nelrod is not in Gibraltar, and probably Repulse as well. And that's going to give you a core of about 4 capital ships, four fairly decent capital ships, and a Repulse as a fast asset. That's a useful force structure. Air power, Glorious and Furious would be 2 I'd send, because they can carry enough aircraft to be a deterrent out there. They're not your most modern carriers, but they're fine and they're flexible throughout their need out there. And Ark Royal probably, because she can be her own support carrier. Unicorn is not available yet, but when she is, she'd be deployed out there. And Implacable and Indefatigable aren't available yet. Again, I've got the same pause as historically happened in construction. But Formidable, Victorious and Indomitable, and renowned King George V, Prince of Wales and Duke of York in the Atlantic is a fairly strong force. Add in any French ships available that have decided to come over. Very good. Probably a couple of R's providing convoy escorts based out of Halifax in Canada, and probably another couple of R's along with Eagle and Hermes sitting in the Mediterranean. Enough forces to keep in sort of the eastern base in the Mediterranean to protect British interests in that region. Ensure there's no problem from German proxies in that region. So viable ships, enough capability to do that job, definitely. The big difference is going to be, especially in the China station, is going to be that those cruisers, which were historically called away, probably haven't been run down quite so much. But whilst the S and the U class boats of the submarine service will no doubt be in massive demand in northern European waters, the T class boats pretty much all going to be funneled out to the Far East. And this is an impact, because if you consider, we're talking mostly about the Batch 1 boats, of which there are, I think, 15 built. Thetis sometimes is counted twice if she gets salvaged and rebuilt as Thunderbolt. But in service in 1941, if we discount the ones lost to the Germans off Norway, which is Tarpon and Thistle, sunk in 1940, the rest of the losses were all to Mediterranean by 1940-41 were all in the Mediterranean to the Italians. That means you have roughly 13 available in 1941 of the T-class. Let's say I do decide I want to keep some home for Atlantic work, so let's say 5 are back in the Atlantic. There could be as many as 8 sitting in the Far East, operating from Singapore. They have an impressive range, and if you add in other submarines available, which would not be lost, you don't need to have your big mine-laying submarines doing runs to Malta in this scenario, do you? You don't even have your big mine layers, your fast mine layers sitting in the Mediterranean helping doing fast runs. You're not losing merchant ships in the Mediterranean at this point. And your convoys are very different in your Atlantic campaign, because if you've got able to run aircraft into Norway and out of Norway in terms of maritime patrol aircraft with their surface search radar, then submarines are going to find transiting through the North Sea to get into the North Atlantic very difficult. And remember, this is 1940, 1941, when the Germans are still building up their submarine strength. This is a severe problem for them. So yes, the force structure starts to be very, very different under this scenario. It really does. And when we consider the earlier in the war, with the three modernised Queen Elizabeth sitting in the home fleet, prior to 1941 being sent out, as they could to form it, then that's going to strengthen the home fleet quite dramatically. Things like Hood might have had some form of modernisation, some form of major refit. Because you've got 3 more capital ships. Okay, yes, Queen Elizabeth herself, not really available to 1941, but you've always got a significant battle fleet in the Mediterranean. At times it goes as high as 4 or 5 capital ships. Well, in this scenario, you don't need them there. You've got a couple of R's. That's all. And yes, historically those would be in the Indian Ocean, but you can have far better assets in the Indian Ocean in this scenario. So realistically, the home fleet earlier in the war is going to be a lot stronger, and is going to be able to maintain its strength far better, because before the Germans get into a position where they can start regularly bombing British yards and doing the damage they do, you've got a lot more time to refit the ships you want to refit. So, you've refitted more ships, so let's say Hood has had a refit. Repulse might have had something minor as well. I wouldn't be surprised if Repulse had got a quick... Probably radar and a few other things like that added in. Maybe a slight upgrade to air defense weaponry. There's stuff you could do quickly, which isn't going to take a lot of time in yard time, but is going to yield quite good results. So probably all that's going to be part of it. And as said, I'd reckon your Indian Ocean forces send around Ark Royal, Furious, Glorious, the Queen Elizabeth class, and probably Rodney, because she gets those kind of deployments, and Repulse. That's a good force to build it around. It's a very good force to build it around. And possibly, although unlikely, I think they won't get any of the bigger destroyers. I think things like the Tribals, the J's, and the L's will be back in the Atlantic and the home fleet as part of home fleet operations to provide the capabilities in the very rough seas of the North Atlantic to support things like Hood going out hunting or anything like that. But they're still going to probably have decent destroyers. They probably will have decent enough destroyers out there and enough destroyers out there. Who will be in command becomes an interesting one, because in this scenario, I don't need Cunningham in the Mediterranean. You don't need Cunningham in the Mediterranean. You don't. There are other senior officers you can put there. You don't need him replacing the commanders of Home Fleet. They are perfectly fine at their job. But what you might do is make a new senior commander Far East, and Cunningham could be perfect for that role. So I won't be surprised if he is out there, at least during the initial phase. I would also not be surprised if you have a very different roster in terms of other senior officers. The ground forces commanders will be different. All the force commanders out there will be very different, because you're not fighting in North Africa. And as much as we might like to deploy the same amount of forces to Norway as we would historically North Africa, there isn't the space for them. There isn't. So that I've been scratching my head all day thinking about this, trying to figure out, this is one of the reasons my hair's such a mess. Where would we do? How many forces would we be deploying to Norway? Consistently, it's not going to be more than a couple of divisions. There are going to be huge amounts of troops left on the table as far as British concerned. Maybe they're deployed to the UK to prepare for reopening a second front invading Europe. But also, they could well be garrisoning positions around the Empire. They could be doing what they historically did. You're probably still going to have the pre-war divisions that were there, and maybe additional forces supplementing them, in Malaya. And when the Japanese move into Indochina, wouldn't be surprised if you find yourself dealing with a more senior officer out there, and more forces deployed to Malaya, to Burma, to protect them. With more troops going with them. And they'll have the troops to do it. Without North Africa, without the Mediterranean conflict, you suddenly have a whole lot more resources available for the British Empire. A whole lot more resources. And a whole lot of senior officers. Now, yes, you haven't had the experience of World War II so far. You haven't had the same armour experience you get in the North African campaign. You haven't had the same lessons in air defence of the fleet that you get in the Mediterranean. But you've had some. You will have had some. And you've got some opportunities for them. So, yeah, you're still going to be fighting. And you're still going to be quite capable. And you're also not going to have lost a lot of those people. Think about all the people who get lost in the war, captured. Think about all of the commanders who get spent because they can't deliver what Churchill wants in North Africa. You add all this together and, yeah, there's a lot more resources going around. There's a lot more strength. There's a lot more capability. And you're not losing the people. You're not losing the ships. You're not losing the things you'd lost historically in the Mediterranean. But you're also not losing the same forces in the North Atlantic. You're not, because if the Germans try and get out, if they try and break out in the North Atlantic, they are going to be having to go between that overflying group, patrol aircraft flying between Norway and the UK. Okay? So think about it. Surface raiders, if you're a surface fighter, you're going to be intercepted. There are going to be ships able to come out. They're going to see you coming a long way. They're going to be able to maneuver into that position. So if we go back to those ships, yeah, it might well be that Bismarck comes out with Scharnhorst. But the odds are Bismarck, if it comes out with Scharnhorst, runs into King George V, Prince of Wales, and Renown, maybe even Hood as well, having had a bit of a refit, supported by victorious and formidable. That's not a good scenario for those ships. Plus destroyers, plus cruisers. In simple terms, under those scenarios, they come out, they run into a full fleet. And they're going to be seen coming because it doesn't take that many maritime patrol aircraft to establish a consistent patrol over the North Sea, heading between Britain and Norway on multiple levels, if you have bases both sides that they can refuel and repair at. It's just not that difficult. So the scenario becomes different. The scenario becomes very different, and that's where we have to start working things out. Because the odds are Japan's still not going to attack Britain under this scenario. But I could see them still doing something stupid. You see, if they manage to get away with taking Vichy France's Indochina, I could see them thinking, right then, we've got away with this, and Britain did nothing, because Britain probably would do nothing, because they would rather not have a war in the Far East if they can avoid one. And they're not going to go to war to prevent Vichy France, which is one of the reasons why it's more advantageous to the British if the French forces which are in Britain are neutral in turn forces rather than Free French. If they're Free French, they might have decided to take one of their bigger ships out to Indochina and recover it for the Free French. If they are neutral or interned, they can't do that. It also fits better with the scenario. At which point, they take Indochina. They get away with it. They get diplomatic protests, they get various forms of sanctions, but they don't get anything else. So to get around those sanctions, what to go? Well, the nearest source of oil to them is the Dutch East Indies. It is. It's the Dutch East Indies. It's a, go for it. And Dutch are also occupied by the Germans. The Germans will quite happily sign over the Dutch East Indies. There's a trouble, though. The Dutch East Indies are free Dutch. This time, if you attack them, well, that's going to lead to a response from Britain. Now, with submarines and cruisers acting as a tripwire from both the British and the Dutch in that region, and the British having a lot more submarines in that region than needed historically, because they've withdrawn pretty much all of them to the Mediterranean, you're going to have problems. The Japanese are going to have problems, but maybe the Army and Navy can cooperate enough to get this done. I doubt it, but they can. Maybe they can. And launching from Indochina to go to take the Dutch East Indies, that's actually possible. That's actually a possible invasion route and a possible possibility of attack route. But the thing is, the British are not going to be able to ignore that, and neither are the Americans, but we'll explain why now. You see, if the Japanese are attacking the Free Dutch, Churchill's going to feel he has to go to war to defend them, and he has to protect them. He's also going to feel he's got quite a strong fleet in the Indian Ocean, so he's going to think, Cunningham, I let him loose. And Cunningham's going to be thinking, I can do something about the Japanese. I can. I can't do an offensive war. I haven't got the resources to go forward and impose the blockade on Japan myself. But oh boy, do I have the forces to go and cause trouble for a Japanese attack on the Dutch East Indies. Look at my carrier strength. Look at them. Look what I have. I can do something here. So British will declare war. The thing is, again, for Roosevelt, it makes his life a bit easy, because he'll probably also declare war for the similar reasons, but his argument will go, we have imposed sanctions on the Japanese because of what they've done. They have decided to try and get around the sanctions by invading another nation's territory to get access to fuel. They are trying to evade our sanctions by invasion and gross aggression against a friend, the Dutch. It's not about attacking the British. It's not about defending the British. It's about defending the Dutch. In which case, he promptly declares war. This is going to be a fun thing, because odds are Hitler does what he did historically as well. But there's going to be a different scenario here, because you have no war going on in North Africa. You have a battle going on in Norway, which I could see the Americans deploying troops to, which would be really interesting to see American and British troops backing up the Free Norwegians, trying to push south in Norway, and what kind of technologies and things come out of that scenario. But also, they could deploy their bombing forces and try and support their bombing forces in Norway to bomb Germany, which is going to give them range to hit the oil fields, definitely, which is going to cause the Germans more trouble. I'm not sure if the Germans will invade the Soviet Union in this scenario. They possibly still do invade the Soviet Union, but if they do, then the Arctic convoys are going to be a lot easier, because with the Allied control of northern Norway, there's a lot of those. A lot of the area where those convoys are at risk are now well behind, per se, safe Allied lines. There's also the reality that it's gonna Swedish iron ore is going to be able to get out through northern Norway. Finland might not feel it's sensible to ally with Germany in this circumstance, because of course they can be resupplied through Sweden across the Baltic at this point by allies to stop to support them. So they might decide they want to join the Allied scenario, which also acts as another buffer against Soviet invasion, but leave that to one side if they join the Allies. So there are all sorts of complicated things going on in Northern Europe here at this point, but I don't want to get into that too much, because we're doing this scenario of Japan. I think in this scenario, the arguments are going to be kind of interesting, but I think if you've got the Japanese are invading, and they're going to have forces there covering, the British are going to be probably first to reach that. They're going to be coming from closer. I wouldn't be surprised if they've moved forward and move forces forward into the region of Singapore. They won't be based from Singapore, but they will have probably a fast force in the region of Singapore. And I wouldn't be surprised if they were sent to attack the invasion fleet. And the thing is, being the British, the odds are it's going to be Ark Royal, Glorious and Furious, which for some reason has unitalicized themselves. Now, if it is those ships, that's a different group than historically there was in this area by a long margin. For starters, it's no longer capital ships on their own, it is capital ships and carriers. And, well, these ships, they're going to be different. They're able to launch a night strike, and roughly between them, once you take out fighters and other allocations, you're probably left with a strike force of about 96 albacores. Probably about 96 albacores. They're probably operating a mixture of Wildcat and Sea Hurricane fighters. Maybe even possibly still have some Fulmars aboard, because again, you haven't had the Mediterranean to sap that strength. They haven't had the Mediterranean to sap their strength of operations. They've been operating from the UK and as carrier aircraft from the UK, carriers operating from the UK previously, so they'll have built up a different infrastructure support. But it could well be Wildcats and Albacores are forming the base of their air groups at this point. Or something similar. Maybe even Brewster Buffaloes in this history, but, well, unlikely. Unlikely, as I don't see the officers changing their decisions that much when it comes to the aircraft procurement. The thing is, that strike hitting a Japanese force at night is going to do quite a lot of damage. And again, they still have air surface radar at this point. They're going to be able to use that to strike, go in, and they're going to aim for the bigger blips. So they're going to aim for any battleships which are in the force, which in this scenario probably is going to be limited to Congos and carriers, which is not good. If they hit Congos and carriers, if they manage to take out enough of them, and again, the Albacore could also do it. The British torpedo scenario. You've got the fact that they can do, in shallow water, they can still make sure their torpedoes belly flop. They can always make sure their torpedoes belly flop because of the fact that whilst everyone sort of mostly goes on fins and buoyant nose to try and stop the torpedo diving in when it hits the water, because naturally when they hit the water they tend to do that and dive down deep and hit either the bottom of the water, either hit the seabed or actually dive so deep they run underneath the enemy ships. The British add an attention wire, which basically means they belly flop. Requires precise flying, but it makes it possible. The thing is, that combined, don't that many torpedo bombers hitting in the waters in that area, the Japanese could lose a lot of ships. A lot of ships. And the thing is, some of their fighter aircraft, which I haven't included numbers, could of course be skewer dive bombers. They could still be in service, in which case they could be used as part of Night Strike as well. There's a lot of aircraft, and those 3 ships between them can carry about 160 odd aircraft, depending on their configurations and how many of which type they're carrying. So a strike of 96 aircraft is kind of lowballing it a bit, considering British practice. Now the thing is, the Japanese might well want to follow that up, but who knows what sort of... They might also know that there's an American task force coming their way as well, as fast as it can, and that could be arriving the next day. So you go off hunting for the British, you can be out of position for dealing with the Americans. Whatever happens, It's not good. Expect a very different war from that to that which was fought, but possibly quicker. As larger RN forces earlier on negate the Japanese night fighting advantage, in fact, the British long-range night strike capabilities might negate that completely and undermine their abilities to actually respond. Philippines not being attacked straight away in this scenario because instead of going for Pearl Harbor and trying to attack the Americans, they're trying to get around and not have a war with the Americans and not have a war with the British. Would mean that those forces were intact and able to respond. So you've got heavy bombers coming for you, you've got Royal Navy carrier aircraft, and you've got the American forces coming across the Pacific as quickly as they can. I'm not sure about what you will be thinking at this point, but in my scenario, and in any scenario I can envisage or I have worked out, simulated, the Kido Butai basically gets wiped out. There are various levels of losses suffered by the Allied forces. There are. But the fact is, they're not going to survive the combined might and get home. And that's the real trouble for the Japanese. Getting home in this scenario. And if they lose the Kido Butai, if they lose all that, then their rapid expansion is out of the count. They might get a foothold in Dutch East Indies. They might well get a lot of troops ashore. And that might become numero uno to push them out of. And there might be a ground war from Malaya into Indochina, or Indochina into Malaya, one way or the other. But especially as the Japanese were planning on not attacking the British just at this point, but waiting till after they take the Dutch East Indies, then they're going to be facing dilemma after dilemma after dilemma, and loss after loss after loss. Because they're not going to be dealing with the weakened forces they did historically deal with, weak in terms of numbers, but also in terms of experience and command structure and the people who are available. They're not going to be dealing with weakened forces they do historically in terms of naval power. They're going to be running into the full force of Royal Navy T-class submarines and all the rest that are out there. This is not going to be a good scenario for the Japanese. They're going to lose a lot of ships. They're going to lose a lot of men. And getting the Dutch East Indies, it's not going to be achieved, probably. They might take it over, but the amount of forces they'll be able to pour in there, how quickly they'll be cut off from home, all these things will conspire against them and stop them being able to hold on to it for long. And that ultimately then leads to the American, probably a scenario where this leads to a Japan first scenario. It'll be quicker to build up and encircle Japan, and probably following the British plan to extent more, because the British are getting more heavily involved. The idea of we must blockade Japan and starve it. Yeah, we'll build up the idea of invasion, but let's push forward and try and get to the point at which we can blockade Japan. I can see the Americans being very keen on that idea. So expect after the Dutch East Indies have been liberated, the next target probably will be Hong Kong, Weihai Wei. Once you've got Weihai Wei, you're sort of close enough you can start enforcing a blockade and supporting naval forces carrying out a blockade of Japan. Also, you're in great strike range for bomber aircraft. And at that point, it's going to be a toss-up as to whether they invade Europe first or they invade Japan first. I would say probably if they think they can be regarded as liberators, they're going to go after Europe first. But it's also going to depend on what's happened to Germany in this time, because if the bomber forces have done what they can from Norway, which is that much closer and that much more able to hit the targets they need to in Germany, then the German economy could be in shutters. If they have actually also still carried out the invasion of the Soviet Union, then they are quite possibly on their last legs. There are all sorts of problems going on in this scenario, mainly because Italy is neutral. And to keep Italy neutral, you had to do these things, but it means that a lot of the war effort which the Germans do and a lot of their security doesn't come about. the other thing we talked about, Greece and Crete before. Well, you can hit the oil fields from down the oil fields that Germany depends on from that direction as well. And if Greece still ends up joining the Allies for some reason, that's not good for the Germans. Basically, it means they'll be overstretched and unable to respond at far earlier point in the war, because the Italians are often discounted in terms of their effects and their capabilities. I can understand that to an extent, because the Italians were always often not sure what they were fighting for. But the Italians were good troops, and they were in a strategically very advantageous position, which meant everyone had to pay attention to them. And they also had thus far the strongest navy of the Axis forces until the Japanese joined. Far the most balanced and definitely the strongest in terms of its firepower and actual capabilities. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you found it interesting. I certainly did, thinking it all through and looking at it and going, well, this does free up rather a lot of forces, and this causes quite a lot of things. But to make it happen the way the question did, I think you had to make it kind of convoluted. Because there are certain things I just don't think would have happened. I think, honestly, if you had those extra 90,000 troops, I think the chance of France falling, like it did historically, goes way down. Because I do not see why you don't have an extra division in the Ardennes. Considering they were complaining about not having enough troops there, an extra division, an extra 20,000 troops, that's going to solve a lot of problems in the Ardennes. And probably the same with the rest. They're going to be deployed places where they can be useful. That all being said, I always finish these videos on a question, and this is not going to be without its question. Its question is this. If the war is like this, and it is shorter, and the number of carrier battles are fewer, maybe just a Royal Navy night strike, and then a US air battle, a US Navy air battle in a day later on, a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of days or a couple of weeks later. Was there lessons taken away from World War II for carrier operations? What happens? What's learnt? What's not learnt? What do you think we might be learning to our cost later on, and when do you think it'd be? I'd be really interested to hear what you say and hear what you think. And I'm going to finish, as I do at the moment, by thanking everyone again for donating and supporting the channel, because as most of the stuff has been going on Calex's and the Calex Fund to get the office working early enough, because again, I said many times, I am still getting over pneumonia and I'm not able to do the carpentry I normally would do. There are a long list of jobs here I would like to do. There are a long list of things which I haven't done and I want to. And it's only thanks to all of you that I'll be able to achieve what I have. So, thank you. And thank you for supporting the channel. And what else have we got coming up? Next week it's 881 Squadron Royal Navy. Oh, that's going to be an interesting history. And then it's conception, operation, and conclusion of the Queen Elizabeth class, the modern aircraft carriers. Do you want to say goodbye? Or you just come here because you've heard I'm summing up and you're thinking it's Pat time? He thinks it's Pat time. He's such a poodle. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care, and hope you have a nice evening.